good morning for everyone. I hope you already have a good rest last night after a very long session of, I think, maybe 20 panels yesterday. I went to 4 of them. Welcome to a very special panel today. Why I said it's special? Because I have a reason. Let's see like this. This is the only panel that has a title of Jokowi in that, in that title. And then next week, Jokowi will be here. So maybe there are causality and correlation between this panel and then Jokowi will be in UK next week. So thank you for Andy, my supervisor, for letting me chairing this session. This we have like 1.5 hours. So we will present each presenter for 15 minutes at max. And then at the end of the session, we will have 30 minutes for discussion. All the 4 topics is like equally interesting because it's like trying to figure out, for instance, the first one here is about how we can evaluate and monitoring the inclusiveness of economic policy of Jokowi, for instance, and also the other topic. Now to make it short, and because we have a very limited time, we will start with the first presentation from Dr. Arif and Dr. Andi Stamner about this very interesting paper about how inclusive the economic growth of Indonesia for the like almost 20 years period. It could be like the way of evaluating and monitoring the economic policy of Indonesia. So please, Arif and Andy,
I think I'm
come forward. Yeah,
I'm starting.
Yeah.
Thank you. So as you can see, there's a set of projects and work here around issues of growth and social policy, decentralisation and political economy in Indonesia, and the group of us at King's College. So I'm going to introduce some of the background to this particular paper, and then hand over to Arif on after that, and then come back to the conclusion. The basic, the kind of background here is, so Indonesia faces a set of challenges. Firstly, that poverty reduction appears to be slowing. Secondly, that unequivocally inequality has risen quite dramatically. Perhaps one of the most rapid increases across the developing world. And coupled with that, growth is slowing in Indonesia. And of course, if one wants to talk about inclusive growth in any way, having some growth or more growth to talk about may be an important part of the equation. So these are the kind of 3 challenges that frame the paper around inclusive growth. I think my interest here as well in the Jokowi presidency is the extent to which what's happening in Indonesia actually might provide lessons or ideas or a model for the broader developing world, not least the reallocation of regressive subsidies to infrastructure and social policy, and the potential that might have for the eradication of poverty and the boost to economic development. And given that those kind of changes were discussed a long time in Indonesia, but Jokowi actually has done it, although it remains to be seen what happens when oil prices start rising. I think there's some interesting lessons that Indonesia provides to the rest of the developing world in terms of what can be achieved. At a very crude level, if you took in another paper I've done, if you took the regressive fossil fuel subsidies in every developing country, you would eradicate about 70% of world poverty at $2.50, let alone at the lower poverty line. The World Bank uses at $1.90. So I think there's interesting lessons that Indonesia might provide for the rest of the developing world. So the paper itself focuses on, we cut the data by administration, because anyway you cut lines, you're going to be arbitrary to some sense. So we thought it might be fun to try and look at the different administrations in Indonesia and how they'd approach this idea of inclusive growth, which we'll discuss what we mean by. And then, because Jokowi's only actually been in office for a relatively short period of time, there's a limited amount we can say about the period, but we should outline why we think the prospects what his prospects for inclusive growth may depend on, some of the important variables. So we focus on the growth incidence curve, the distribution of benefits of growth across the distribution, and relatedly on change in inequality in the different administrations. We look at the national poverty line, which Indonesia, like India and China, has one of the lowest national poverty lines in the world. It's an incredibly low poverty line, and because of that, we discussed the national poverty line, but we feel it's also important to look at the multidimensional poverty measure developed here at Oxford, in fact, by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative group at Queensland House. So it expands the lens into education, health, poverty, and we developed that into employment as well, and a set of indications from the Sysnaps. So inclusive growth in the global literature is very much focused historically as a concept that grew out of pro-poor growth, and if you trace it back before that, you can look at growth with equity, even redistribution with growth perhaps, and some of the debates about economic development and poverty from the 70s onwards. You have this demarcation between absolute and relative pro-poor growth. Either the growth is poverty reducing, it raises the income of the poor, or it reduces the poverty headcount or whatever poverty line, or it's relative pro-poor growth, and it's that inequality is falling, so the poor benefit more than the non-poor from growth. Then inclusive growth over the last 10, 15 years or so has expanded the lens to include issues of participation in the growth process itself, in employment in particular, but also in access to public goods. And inherently it moves the debate on from a focus necessarily or largely on monetary poverty to also include other aspects of poverty. So we look at the growth incidence curve, the Gini, the Palmer index, that's the ratio of the top 10 to the bottom 40%, and multidimensional poverty using the Sysnaps for the last 21 years. For those of you who don't know, the Multidimensional Poverty Index developed at the Poverty and Human Development Initiative, as I mentioned, is a measure of education, health, standards of living and household assets, and we extend that to employment in terms of pulling out the data from the Sysnaps for the beginning and the end of each administration in a lot more detail. I hope the organisers of the conference will actually put in a lot of these PowerPoints online, but I'm not sure exactly. Oh, of course you've got the videos, which I guess you've got. I'm going to hand over in terms of the data and then come back. Thanks, Julie.
Okay, let me discuss a bit about the results. So, as you can see here, that we found that this is the growth incidence curve. So, when you read from here to here, this is the 1% poorest, and this is the 1% richest, from the poorest to richest. And then we have 4 curves, each representing period of administration. I'm careful here, not representing the administration, okay? Representing the period of its administration. So here you can see that during the Suharto era, just the start, just toward the and also in the middle of the economic crisis in 1996, the inequality and the increase of the income or expenditure of the poor and the rich is actually not really different. And apparently, the poor's income rise faster, a little bit faster than the rich. So it means this will be a period of slightly either constant or declining inequality. And then after the end of the crisis, national crisis, then we have the period of Gus Dur and Megawati. And then this will be like, I can call it, this is like neutral, so constant. So not rising inequality. And you can see here, during those 2 periods, the inequality, both in Gini coefficients and the Palmer index, practically constant. So there's no increase in inequality for the last 10 years. But when SBY start beginning the administration, you can see there is startlingly different picture. So you can see here that during the first period of SBY, the first 5 years, SBY1, this is the inequality here. This is the first one, and this is the second one. So both has very inequality increasing growth, meaning that the growth of the 10% or 1% richest, for example, during the last period of SBY grow like 10% per year in real term, yet the growth of the poorest only only rise by 4 or 5%. So, and it's explained why during this period, inequality rising quite rapidly. Particularly, as Andy mentioned before, the rise of the inequality in Indonesia during the last 10 years is actually the most most rapid one in the developing world during this last 10 period. And this is the change. So you can see the period of the SPY 1 and 2 was marked by the and then just a little bit attempt to explain what may happen. There are many possible reasons, but the one that I'd like to share our thought with you is especially during the second period, 2009 to 2014. So during this period, you can see that starting from here actually, there is a rising commodity price, but the commodity price started falling in 2011. So we might think there is a possible reason why commodity boom may have to do with the inequality, because a commodity like coal, palm oil, or oil is very capital intensive and land intensive. So the rising price of this commodity may be distributed bias toward the rich. So then we attempt to divide these two periods, the period of commodity boom and the period of falling commodity boom, and then we find an interesting result, which simply not concluding that this is the cause of the inequality, but at least there is a strong correlation. So the period of commodity boom is correlated with the non-inclusive growth or not proper growth, but the period of falling commodity price. So this perhaps needs some more research to confirm this. And then this is the result for the multidimensional poverty. So we did it for monetary poverty first. The monetary poverty we only calculated or compared from 1999 because before then the poverty line was different. So we cannot, it's not comparable. So we just showed from 1999 where the poverty line is the same. So and then here is the multidimensional poverty. So what I would like to highlight here is that you can see that both, as you might expect, both monetary poverty and multidimensional poverty are falling. Here is and then the rate of the falling is slower during the SBY period. There are many reasons for this. One of them because the previous administration or the previous period has a bigger baseline. So if we have a bigger baseline, the rate of change is higher. But I believe that's not the only explanation. There may be other explanations.
2 minutes more.
All right. Okay. Skip this. There is a sensitive analysis, but I just want to say that the multidimensional poverty that we calculate is correlated with income, but income or expenditure only explain 20%. There are others. So there are more research to do. And then I would like to also explain here the deprivation indicator by dimension. So there are 4 dimensions. All of the dimensions except employment rising quite slowing down quite rapidly. Now let's come to the Jokowi. So first, Jokowi has come as a president in the era of increasing inequality, which means people think this is a hope. There's a hope that he can redirect this trend. So the direction is okay because this is the first period of administration where Gini coefficient was in the government plan. It's interesting, really. And the budget especially, this is the thing that I appreciate so much because Jokowi managed to remove not the whole thing, but almost almost the majority of fuel subsidy into I just left a little bit and transfer it or redistribute it into infrastructure and slightly a bit of property or social value. However, I would like to mention that the targeted social spending under Jokowi is practically not really different than the previous period, even though in the campaign it was very progressive, but not that different. There are many programs that only change names, but the essence is not different.
Maybe this question.
Okay, and then the one important thing is in the first year of Jokowi administration, poverty rise. So that's a bad indication. And here the growth incidence of the Jokowi period, Jokowi first six-month period, we will update it soon. But this first 6 month period, when you see that the growth of the poor is negative. So that's why it's important. And one of the reasons is food price. So Jokowi administration management on the price or staple food price is very poor compared to previous administration. So let me conclude.
So in conclusion, I'd say one thing briefly about answering the question of the paper is how inclusive has growth been in Indonesia. Between different administrations, it makes, in general, it makes a substantial difference to the picture you find depending on how you define inclusive growth, of course. If you define it by the growth incidence curve, then you would tend to find administrations other than the SBY period were substantially more inclusive. In terms of looking ahead for the prospects for inclusive growth under Jokowi, we think there's 4 areas that are likely to be very important in the future period in determining the pattern of growth, who benefits over the administration, and potentially if Jokowi is re-elected, of course. The first is the impact of the infrastructure spend, assuming it goes ahead on the scale that's intended, and the kind of growth it triggers. It could be employment generation, but it may go to areas that are already relatively better off. We argue there are theoretical and empirical challenges which could take the infrastructure spend and its impact on growth in the future in different directions in terms of distribution. Secondly, the reallocation of equality of opportunities through changes to health and education spending. As was mentioned, there's some changes in the amount of money, but not proportionally nowhere near the size of the infrastructure shift. But actually, the policies themselves are largely the same with a little bit more money. Actually, we show how adding a small amount of what might be spent on infrastructure over to social policy could have an enormous difference on health, education, poverty outcomes, and the Gini coefficient. As was also mentioned, the impact of rice prices will be particularly important, and what happens to rice prices over the next period. And underlying all this is a question mark about whether the subsidy on the fossil fuel subsidy has been reduced, or whether it's just a result of lower oil prices, and as oil prices start rising, the pressure for this subsidy, the amount that's spent on it, may increase. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Andy and Arif for the very interesting presentation. I believe a lot of questions from you, but as I said earlier, that we will put it at the end of the session after all presenting. The next presentation is from Darendra, who work for Bapnas and currently is PhD student in King's. All of us actually from the same department. So Darendra will see the fiscal aspect of economic development in Indonesia. It is related to how the central government allocate the fiscal to the subnational level. Please.
Thank you, Pak Didi. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. I'm very pleased and delighted to see you in this panel, especially in the early morning of this conference. Yes, as has been mentioned by Pak Didi, I try not to disappoint you, although we have a big title on the political economy of Jokowi on the inclusion. but my topic slightly a little bit a detour on the decentralization and its impact on the distribution, especially on the subnational government fiscal size. Yeah, and that is the full title of my presentation today. I will start with the outline that I'm going to present this morning. First is on the background of, or the history, the origin of the decentralization in Indonesia, and a little bit on the distribution of intergovernmental transfers on the existing condition and the disparities of the regions. Then I will move on to the literature review, the literature discussing on these related issues. Then I try to do the modest, I've been doing exercise, modest exercise using cluster analysis, which is more common in business analysis, to get the characteristics of groups of variables or unit of analysis, to see the characteristics, the similarities, the differences on different sets of data. And then I will present you the results, and after this I will get you to the conclusion. So let me just start with, briefly with the decentralization, the origin. As probably most of you know that the law of decentralization has been was stipulated in 1909, but it was effectively implemented starting in January 2001 with the significant power on the devolution. Is not only on the authority but also on the budgeting, transfer to the second level of the administrative levels, which means the district and the municipalities, and that also attracts that creates the incentive of creating the new region, the new regencies, new towns, new places with this power. And then the level of democratization has been deepening until today. Starting from 98, then we have the direct election introduced in 2004, and this day we have deepened the level of democratization to the local election. So in total, every citizen of Indonesia should participate in. Now we have around 1,024 elections in a year, which means that almost 3 elections in a day in 1 year. And yeah, we have the different concept of decentralization implemented in several regions out of different purposes. Like for instance, in Aceh, after the results of the negotiation in Helsinki, and Papua for the prolonged discussion with the local communities. The local government has shown their improvement, but there are issues on the disparities, on the unequal distribution, unequal performance. There has been an increasing level of participation, level of capacity, but there is still an issue on some places, especially in outside of Java or in isolated places. In terms of the distribution of transfer, let me recall a little bit that the decentralization mainly giving the expenditure rights to give the fungible funds at the lower level, but not the significant taxation or revenue power, and that creates heavily dependency of the local government for transfer from the central government. The problem is, until today we haven't concluded the correct or the proper formula for getting away these transfers. Even until today, though we have enacted the village law, we haven't found the formula for the village transfer yet. And that is the stylized type of the transfer. So almost 1/3 of the total state budget was devolved or given to the second tier of regional level. At the same time, the central government also still maintains they are still exercising their intervention, although it's being spent at the local level through the deconcentration mechanism, which amounts around 10% of the total budget. So in total, almost half of the total state budget was spent at the regional level. And the trend shows that it's showing increasing trend over the last 5 or 6 years, especially in the islands, big islands outside Java. It shows quite a significant amount of positive increase, and that makes us wonder whether the other islands of Java could catch up with the development level in the mainland of Java. And let's and that brings me to these issues on the discussion of formulating the transfer. The first is, most of the time the transfers was decided through the political influence, though we have already the mechanism in place, like the deliberation forum from the lowest local level, Muslim Bangladesh, until the top level, the big deliberation forum involving the stakeholders from the central government ministries, agencies, to the stakeholders at the local level. So every year we have this forum to get together and set the priorities, but at the end of the day, the political decision still matters. And then we have this concept of both harmless. It means that the regions will not receive less amount of budget comparing the previous year, and that makes difficult to evaluate, to let alone to punish or to give a sanction if they do not perform or spend their budget. And yeah, we had this also, the existence of lump sum fungible component, which is meant to compensate the overhead costs, or like administrative daily spending of the local governments. And yeah, then as I mentioned previously, no significant local taxing power, although recently we have devolved the powers of taking the revenue at the local tax. Restricted formula I mentioned here because the formula has been decided without proper consultation, without involving. Yeah, there has been discussion ongoing involving academia, but to my impression, it is not sufficient when we do not involve wider number of stakeholders, especially at the local level. And yeah, the trend was echoed by the analysts. People give their opinions through various media outlets. First is on the Jakarta Post. They are mentioning that this decentralization plan will give more money to regions, and the other columnist in the other East Asia Forum is a medium for the policy analysts from Australian universities that focusing on the plan is not existing yet for formulating this village decentralization level. And other person mentions that there should be affirmative fiscal or budget size for special regions. Let me move on to the existing. That is the fact, the stylish fact that we still struggle with the distribution of income, the poverty, and the inequality. So it seems that the impact of the decentralization has not been felt yet. And now let me move on to the concept of development, which should be incorporated into the concept of decentralization. I will not mention one by one, but I will try to capture the classical view of development until the more recent on the local autonomy, and then I will do the exercise using cluster analysis. And this is the variables I try to incorporate as many representative variables representing the dimensions of each development using the various views of And this is my result. I will not go through into details. I will just show you that we have these different characteristics, sets of clusters, groups of regions that have their different issues. The first cluster is the one that is most backward, which still struggle with the issues of poverty, low employment rate. The next cluster is the slightly better group, and then we move on to the best performing clusters. And then it's a bit surprising, but not really. If take a look into the concentration of the developed clusters, which is mostly concentrated on the developed island of Java and some parts actually in the North Sumatra, and the rest of the region is still require specific attention. And that makes me lead into the last page, the last slide of this presentation, that although it's a bit preliminary modest exercise, but it makes me to reflect that we should consider a larger number of variables before we decide the formulation of the fiscal transfer, especially in the regions, and in welcoming the new concept of the village transfer. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mas Rendra. Just to get some information about the fiscal situation in Indonesia. Last time, on December last year, 2015, the Ministry of Finance, I quote, that it was like 50 billion pounds sterling in the deposit saving of the local bank, Bank Pembangunan Daerah. It is from the money that couldn't be expensed by the local government. So the problem is not only of the distributing from central to the local government, but also how they absorb that money to spend very well in the public service, etc. So we move on to the third presenter, that is Kahun. It is equally interesting to the previous two. That is about how, let's say, intervention style of Jokowi into the economic development of Indonesia. Please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kyung Kim. I'm from International Development Institute at King's College as well. In this talk, I'll analyse the Jokowi government's economic and social policy stance and its future direction. This might be a bold statement, but I believe that we are seeing a quiet rise of developmental state in Indonesia. So between the 1960s and the 1980s, developmental states of East Asian countries such as Korea and Singapore intervened strongly in the economy with an aim of kickstarting and sustaining rapid economic growth. These developmental states used industrial policies of leadership kind to accelerate investment in selected projects with large spillover effects where no private firm wanted to take charge. So while the Yudhoyono government prioritized to attract private investment for infrastructure development and believed that public-private partnership would be the main driver, the Jokowi government has adopted a different view, more similar to that of developmental states. The Jokowi government believes that there are limitations in putting the private sector in the driver's seat, as there are limitations in many of large-scale infrastructure projects, and therefore has decided to take a leading role itself. After cutting fuel subsidies in 2015, the government has increased investment in infrastructure, and as a result, their share of capital spending in the central government expenditure has increased from 12.4% in the past decade on average to 17.8% in 2015. The government also plans to take a leading role in developing strategic industries such as steel and cement production, which are expected to see a boost in demand from the infrastructure sector. So like many developmental states in the past, the Jokowi government has explicitly stated that it plans to use state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, as agents of development. So in 2015, it directly injected 65 trillion rupiah into SOEs, mostly in the infrastructure sector, to support their expansion, and this amount is larger than that in the past decade combined. It accounted for 5.5% of the central government expenditure, which is the highest level since the early 1980s. This marks a sharp contrast with the Yudhoyono government, which once had a radical privatization plan to sell off shares in almost all SOEs. Another feature which resembles developmental states is the Indonesian government's full use of state-controlled financial intermediaries. So the state-owned banks, such as Mandiri, are encouraged to provide loan facilities for infrastructure development and industrialization. Also, Sarana Multi-Infrastructure, excuse my pronunciation, or SMI, the role of SMI has drastically changed. It was created by the Yudhoyono government in 2009, and its major role was to provide financing for PPP projects. But now its president's director perceives channeling capital into SOEs as its major role. And its role in financing SOEs is expected to expand when the government-initiated bill to make it an infrastructure bank passes the House as early as this year. So one major factor that differentiated developmental states from statist governments was the effective use of industrial policies of fellowship kind by the former, while the latter tried to directly organize nearly all industrial activities. So fellowship industrial policies of developmental states involved a hybrid of protectionist and export-oriented policies while being selective in choosing beneficiaries. Likewise, the Indonesian government is using protectionist measures and local content rules in particular with an aim of replacing imports and stimulating domestic industrialization. It has adopted Make in Indonesia policies in selected industries such as motor vehicles, smartphones and airplane manufacturing, which are growing rapidly with an expansion of middle-income consumers. It seems like these policies have so far worked rather well, attracting investment from both global and domestic firms. At the same time, the Jokowi government has adopted more export-oriented view compared to industrial policies under old developmentalism. The Jokowi government plans to provide tax cuts and loans to exporters and simplify trading systems with an aim of stimulating export activities. The Jokowi government is also more realistic and recognizes that the government cannot do everything. For example, the government announced a plan to finally open up the oil refining industry at the end of 2015, and it plans to provide various incentives to private investors. On the other hand, the current government's focus on social policies has been relatively weak. If we look at the central government expenditure by type, we find that the share of social expenditure did not change in 2015, despite a large fiscal space was created through halving the share of fuel subsidies. Moreover, the share of social spending is expected to shrink significantly this year. The government highlights that it has allocated 5% of the total government budget on health for the first time and 20% on education in 2016. But if we take a closer look, it does not look very impressive. The share of the education budget is actually expected to decline slightly from 20.6% in 2015 to a minimum level stated in the Article 31 of the Constitution. The share of the health budget is expected to increase significantly from 3.8% in 2015 to 5% this year, but it is rising from a very low level. The industrial policies are not only difficult to implement, they cost a lot of money. So industrial policies of leadership kind involve large capital investments, and those of fellowship kind require financial support in the form of tax breaks and subsidies. The current Indonesian government has a limited fiscal capacity and therefore cannot significantly expand spending on both industrial and social policies. Despite a huge reduction in fuel subsidies, the fiscal deficit increased to nearly 3% of GDP in 2015, and it was the largest in the past quarter of the century. As a result of the economic slowdown and the government's ambitious target on tax collection, the domestic tax realization rate in 2015 was the lowest in the past decade. The economic growth is expected to pick up this year, but only slightly. Therefore, the revenue collection is again expected to be very difficult. While the fiscal balance is deteriorating, Indonesia is fiscally healthy. If we compare the general government's debt as a proportion of the size of the economy across 20 largest emerging countries, we find that Indonesia is in a relatively good position. On top of Indonesia's strong economic growth and relatively low interest rates in the past decade, its strong fiscal position is the result of the fiscal rule that was adopted in 2003. It caps annual government deficits at 3% of GDP and accumulated debt at 60% of GDP. And this seemed appropriate as the level of government debt was nearly 90% of GDP at the beginning of the 2000s. But now some argue that this fiscal rule should be relaxed, as it is limiting the government's ability to spend more on growth-generating projects. So within its limited wiggle room, the government has decided to stick to Plan A for now. After nearly doubling in 2015, the share of infrastructure spending in the total government budget is expected to reach 15% this year and is likely to remain untouched in the budget revision. The government also plans to inject a huge sum of capital into SOEs, and while it is smaller than last year's and is likely to be reduced through budget revision, it is still very large in a historical comparison. And in the longer term, the government aims to increase the capital expenditure from 2.2% of GDP to 5.3% in 2019, while continuing to reduce energy subsidies. While the government plans to concentrate its budget on industrialization and infrastructure development, it is also chasing efficiency in social policies through targeted mechanisms. So political parties which have expressed support for Jokowi have a majority in the parliament, but of course this does not mean that Jokowi can rely on them to back his agenda, as we saw during the tax amnesty bill negotiation. The Jokowi administration's state-driven economic development strategy have already attracted criticisms after just 1 year. State capital injection into SOEs have now become the new hot potato in budget discussion. So at the end of 2015, the House agreed to pass the budget for 2016 under the condition that state capital injection into SOEs is frozen until they next meet in June this year. Some representatives have argued that the government provision of capital to SOEs after cutting fuel subsidies was in effect reallocation from people's wallet to government bodies. The Democratic Party announced 10 recommendations to the government in March after Yudhoyono's tour de Java. And in a similar tone, the party pointed out that too much state budget for infrastructure will disrupt efforts to eradicate poverty. Pressures for stronger redistributed policies are likely to increase in the coming years. Since the Indonesian economy began to slow down from 2013, the downward trend of the number of poor and the proportion of poor has been stopped. And as the economic recovery is likely to remain weak this year, there is a possibility that this downward trend will even be reversed. At the same time, the government will continue to be under pressure to focus more on social policies. As I've already mentioned, the health budget has been expanded significantly, but the current level is very low even compared to countries with lower income than Indonesia. Furthermore, the deficits at BPJS Kesehatan, which is the operator of the National Health Insurance Program since 2014, are expected to continue rising even after raising users' premiums this month, while the government is sticking to its plan to expand the coverage from 162 million in 2015 to all Indonesians by 2019, which is an increase of around 100 million people. Therefore, the government may have to inject capital into BPJS Kesehatan, as it did in 2015, as it would be politically unpopular and difficult to continue raising premiums. The current economic development strategy may create jobs and stimulate economic activities in the short term through Keynesian channels. But it will be difficult for people to feel the real output effects that are triggered through completed infrastructure investments before the next election. This is due to the long-term nature of infrastructure projects and problems related to land acquisition and intra-government coordination. On the other hand, social policies and subsidies tend to be more visible in the short term and relatively easy to implement. Therefore, the Jokowi government will be pressured or tempted to moderate its state-driven economic strategy in the second half of the presidential term. Against this backdrop, what can the Indonesian government learn from past developmental states? The experience shows that building a developmental state requires more than political guts and leadership. Richard Donner argued in his paper that East Asian countries' impressive institutional capacities emerged from the challenges of economically compensating popular sectors under the conditions of systemic vulnerabilities. It defined these conditions as extreme geopolitical insecurity, which meant high defense spending, and scarce resource endowments. If we apply this theory or view to the current situation of Indonesia, the conditions are not ripe, but they might be. I emphasize they might be moving in the right direction. Compared to the past, the government's firepower is more limited because of the fiscal rule and declining natural resource threats. While external threats are still mild, the government is increasing the military spending amid tensions around the South China Sea. The government plans to increase the defense spending from 0.9% of GDP this year, which is internationally a very low level, to 1.5% by 2020. In any case, we cannot wait until the conditions are perfect. In order to achieve its economic and social goals, the Indonesian government will have to strengthen institutional capacities. It is perhaps more challenging for the Indonesian government than East Asian countries in the past, because building a developmental state under democracy will require even more efficient institutions, as the government has to be both politically and economically inclusive. We have seen improvement in the quality of state bureaucracy in some aspects since the Asian financial crisis, but I believe that there's still a long way to go. This brings me to the conclusion. There will continue to be a heated debate on budget allocation, but I believe that the success of the Jokowi government's ambitious economic and social development plan will ultimately depend on its ability to improve institutional effectiveness. Therefore, the government has to consciously invest in strengthening state capacities, because what Jokowi calls mental revolution will only happen when it is supported with adequate resources. Increasing transparency in SOEs and the infrastructure sector will also be important. A single large graft case can significantly erode the trust in the government and its economic plans, as we saw in the case of Hambalang project. Hopefully the Indonesian government is taking note from incidences around emerging economies where corruption cases involving SOEs are now bringing down their leaders. Lastly, I believe that the government could deal with the rising pressure to strengthen social and redistributive policies by paying special attention on infrastructure with strong social dimensions. Through this, the government may be able to hit two birds with one stone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kahun. So, just one more information that relevant to this presentation is that if we compare the MP-23 Master Plan for Economic Acceleration of Indonesia product of SBY with the book 3 in the National Midterm Plan, it's actually the same, the content, but the strategy of how to pursue that objective is in many ways different. So there's some additional information. Now we move to the last presentation. We have like painting almost many colorful aspect here from economic development, macro, social policy, etc. But then the last presentation is more on like demand side, civil society movement, on how to influence the policy.
Right.
Please.
Thank you, Didi. Good morning. So as you said, the previous three papers were mostly on the political economy of inclusion, or the economics of inclusion, and this one focuses on the politics of inclusion, if you will, or the economic determinants, socioeconomic and demographic determinants of the politics of inclusion. And the paper addresses a very controversial incident that happened towards the end of the very end of the presidency of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, known by his acronym SBY, that happened in September 2014, after Jokowi had already been elected, but before he took office. And it focuses on this incident and on the online activism or engagement in Indonesian social media, which were very prominent. So just to say why should we be interested in that now historical case, actually, arguably Jokowi is very much a child of the local direct elections. If it weren't for the local direct elections in Indonesia, we wouldn't have a President Jokowi, we wouldn't have a leader like Ahok either. So people like Jokowi, who are not part of the political elite, who don't come from the military establishment, very much benefited from the direct local elections in Indonesia. Okay, so social media activism in Indonesia. It is something that everybody sort of has to observe if you read the media. Just this week, or last week, the Jakarta Post wrote, hashtag movements now have become a prominent way for Indonesians to showcase their solidarity on issues online, especially on political issues. There are now an estimated 30 million monthly active Twitter accounts in Indonesia, and in 2014 we had 42 million election-related Twitter conversations in Bahasa Indonesia. There were a number of famous hashtag campaigns now around corruption, for instance, the Save KPK. Koin Untuk Twitter was one of the first bigger hashtag movements in the Indonesian Twitter sphere. So the big question is, what are the drivers of these online collective movements? And only if we can understand what the drivers of these movements are, we can begin to understand of, why we are seeing them, how we should evaluate them normatively, and what to expect in the future in terms of online activism in Indonesia. Let me give you a brief background on the Pilkada Bill controversy. So Indonesia has had direct local elections since 2005. They introduced it legally in 2004. Local elections means people can vote directly for their mayors, for their district heads, for their governors. Since 2010, there's been an increasingly stronger reform initiative around direct local elections or regional electoral franchise. And there's a sort of split between two camps. Reformists on the one hand who said, well, we can improve the Pilkada a little bit, we could make it more efficient perhaps, we could have all the Pilkadas at the same time. And another camp, which you could call an abolitionist camp, which said that the direct local elections really cause a lot of violence, they are associated with corruption, money politics, they are too costly, let's just do away with them and have a more centralized body deciding who becomes a mayor, a governor, a district head. Now, the point in case now is September 2014, when the House of Representatives, the Indonesian parliament, passed the RUU Pilkada, which was a government proposal, and which proposed that regional representatives would now be chosen by regional councils, right? The coming about of this bill is actually quite complicated, and there's a lot of intricacies in how this came about after an 11-hour plenary session of the Indonesian parliament, and the Democrats walking out and basically allowing the opposition to, or the red and white coalition, to pass the bill, and by that to gain executive control over most of the country effectively, in effect, because they controlled most of the regional vote. I found this quote by R.B. Sanit, a political scientist, Indonesian political scientist, very interesting. He said, this is their revenge for Jokowi winning because he's the product of local direct elections. And by there he means the political establishment or the elite in a sense. So what happened after the bill got passed? This gives you an impression of what happened. A massive outburst of public outrage against the passing of the bill. A bit of street protest, hashtags almost anywhere in the city, from streets. This is somewhere by the Bundaran Hi Hotel Indonesia area, I think. This is another direct local elections slogan with a hashtag attached. This is the local TV reporting about Twitter basically, and especially a hashtag that became viral, not only in Indonesia but beyond, which was called Shame on You SBY. Shame on you, President Yudhoyono. You allowed this bill to be passed. You got rid of our local direct elections. Interestingly, that hashtag stayed in the Twitter global trends for 70 hours. So for 70 hours, right above Save SpongeBob, for 70 hours. Shame was put on the president in international social media.
Who was SpongeBob?
SpongeBob? I don't know. I have no idea. It's got nothing to do with Indonesia. Something for future research, maybe. So let's have a look at what happened in the Indonesian Twitter sphere. This is a graph of the hourly volume of Twitter interactions between the 25th and 30th September 2014. What you see is basically a lot of fluctuation and three big bursts of tweets. This is basically nighttime, and then when it gets day again, you have these incredible levels of activity, basically. In the very maximum, you had something like 300 tweets per minute using the hashtag #ShameOnUSBY. In total, we had almost 690,000 interactions, meaning tweets or retweets using that hashtag. Where did they come from? Well, mostly from Java, as it seems. This follows to the degree the socioeconomic and demographic population distribution in Indonesia, but it overrepresents urban areas. It especially overrepresents Western Java, and Java is very prominent. We also have some activity on the Malayan Peninsula, probably from migrant workers, and you have these sort of few dots around cities spread across the rest of Indonesia. What were the political ramifications? I could probably talk about an hour about that, but to give you the story in a nutshell, President Yudhoyono distanced himself immediately. He was actually not in the country at the time the bill was passed. He was at the meeting in the US. He said he'd never wanted that to pass, and he's not going to sign it. He's not going to sign the bill, and then he had to pass a sort of emergency regulation, which ultimately led to a legal annulment of the bill in early 2015. So when Jokowi already had taken office. What's interesting to note, just as a side note, is that President Yudhoyono seemed very much a Twitter person himself, right? He was very focused on this kind of stuff. He was checking his Twitter regularly. He was delighted, as they say in this retrospective of his presidency. He was delighted whenever followers rose sharply, and he was paying close attention to critical remarks. So he got a lot of critical remarks in the mid of September 2014. So the question is, who participated in this online protest? And what I'm going to present to you now is the results of an online survey I distributed to a selected group of these people who gave rise to the 690,000 Twitter interactions. We got 400 valid responses out of a relatively big random sample of 20,000 people whom we contacted automatically. It is not a big response rate by any means. It is maybe comparable to some phone surveys, and there are maybe all sorts of issues around who is more likely to respond and so on. We can go into that, but it is sort of the first data that we have in terms of understanding of who are the drivers of these online movements, and it is the best data that, well, it's the only data that is out there at the moment, and you're the first ones to see it, actually. So we distributed an online questionnaire containing 20 questions around demography, around socioeconomic characteristics, and around some political preferences. I'll show you some of these. The demographics. First of all, the age distribution, and I'm comparing here the survey data to representative household survey data on the population aged over 16 in 2012. What you see at one glance, basically, is that almost half of the people who tweeted shame on USBY are in the age bracket of 16 to 24. Indonesia has a young population, but this group is definitely overrepresented in the south, right? So it's a very young group, and you've almost nobody in the age bracket of 55 plus who are engaged in that. Maybe not surprisingly. I mean, these people just don't use Twitter necessarily. In the middle, it's sort of relatively closely corresponding to what the general pattern is in the population. household size. Interestingly, maybe surprisingly, the average household size of survey respondents was actually a bit larger than the average in the population. This may have to do with the age structure again, because more people are young, more people are maybe likely to live with their parents, so the average household size is going to be a bit bigger. Now, this is a very puzzling finding for me, and I've tried to, I don't know, come up with an explanation for that. Maybe you can help me. The distribution between males and females in Indonesia is roughly 50-50. The distribution of survey respondents is roughly 25 to 75, right? So 3/4 of the respondents are male for some reason. This might be representative perhaps of the demographics of Twitter users in Indonesia. It might be even more strongly biased towards males due to the political engagement aspect of it. I don't really know. It's something for future exploration. Okay, so a few pieces of information on the socioeconomic status of the kinds of people who protested. The education level is extremely high. So we have to do with students, people in secondary education, and people who graduated from university. And that is certainly a massive overrepresentation of the higher education sector, right? So we have around 60% with at least some higher education degree or being in higher education. In the national average is around 10%, which is much lower, obviously. Yes. Looking at occupation, and people, just for you to know, people could pick more than one here. Around 30, a little more than 30% said they are in education, so they may be students or pupils. Interestingly, around another 20 or 40% actually, if you add them together, are employed in the services sector in some form, right? They're either employees or self-employed in the service sector, and then the rest sort of is, there's nothing big that is outstanding. Some employees in industry, quite a few unemployed actually, but mostly standing out is education and people in the service sector. Monthly income. Now this is certainly contentious, and you have to take it with a pinch of salt, because we are asking about self-reported subjective levels of monthly income. What stands out again is around 30% with no fixed income. Not surprising perhaps if 30% are in education. The rest of them are in the range of between 2 million to 4 million mostly, or a bit above rupees per month income. Just for you to compare that, the mean minimum wage is, which is very low, very dire, is around 1.5 million rupees a month, and the mean wage is around 2 million rupees according to the ILO. I'm not quite sure if that isn't an underestimate. Certainly in urban areas it's much higher. Self-reported, I asked people in which sort of social class bracket they put themselves into. 60% say they think they are middle class, whatever that means. Around 30% say they think they are between poor and middle class, and a few think they are between middle class and upper class. Almost nobody thinks they are upper class, almost nobody thinks they are poor, or some of them. Okay, about the political preferences and attitudes. Party preference, this is also something striking. We gave people all the parties that not stood for election but have some share in the parliament, and said, do you identify with any of these at all, or do you have a preference for any of these at all? And more than 30% said none of these. I like none of them. None of these parties at all. And another more than 20% said, I don't want to answer this question, which is quite high, which is more actually than people saying I don't want to answer, or I don't want to declare my income. Then a large share of PDIP supporters, some Gerindra, some PD. The party which is most underrepresented is Golkar, obviously. So they have around 15%. These are the election results from the parliamentary elections in 2014, and Golkar is basically underrepresented in the survey.
Maybe we can like.
Yes, I'm wrapping up. So whom did they vote for in the 2014 elections? Mostly Jokowi. Some of them voted for Prabowo. Some of them didn't vote. Maybe they were too young. And final piece is what is your subjective? We asked people how politically active are you, and we gave them a few examples of like, do you sign petitions, do you participate in street protests, and so on. And this is again actually a similarly puzzling result as the party affiliation is. 35% say they are not politically active at all, right? And if you combine this with the 0, 1, 2, it's more than 50% who say they don't consider themselves politically active, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon how these people who are not necessarily organized civil society or anything like that give rise to a social movement dynamic that is politically quite impactful, right? It is sort of paradoxical. Okay, let me wrap up with just 3 conclusions. It's interesting that these collective actions in Indonesian Twitter or Indonesian social media actually represent to some degree what we call the new social movements in the post-industrial West, what has been observed since the 1960s maybe. Why? Because the class base is exactly that. It's urban, it's very educated, it's service sector based, it's not the labor movement, it's not industrial workers, it's a middle income crowd, however you want to define it. It's also similar in that sense that these are sort of single issue, weakly institutionalized movements, right? They sort of bypass the state. It's not necessary. There is some organized civil society behind that. I'm not denying that. Organizations like Perludem and so on are very active, but by no means enough to constitute that whole movement. What's puzzling, as I told you, what I find puzzling is the male bias, the low party affiliation. We also asked about religion. People are very religious, so it's a non-secularized movement. And this sort of paradox of people considering themselves not very political. Now, just one comment on, somebody told me, a bureaucrat told me, who was actually a part of the Reformasi movement, well, these middle classes, they tweet and then they go to the mall, right? They send a tweet and who cares? It's not very deep commitment in a sense. The question is, if you have a president who keeps checking his Twitter account and who's very reactive to this kind of activism, you don't necessarily need the street protest at all. Let alone street protest being actually a discredited mode of political activism in Indonesia to a high degree. So if people head to the streets, the first question people ask is, well, who paid them to head to the streets, right? And finally, there's certainly something like a digital class divide within the online activism that we see in Indonesia. This doesn't necessarily imply a problem. In such a case where sort of the middle class interest is aligned with broader issues, with things that people can broadly subscribe to, that is not a problem. It may be a problem, however, in other cases, fuel subsidies might be perhaps one of them, where exactly this group might exert pressures that are not necessarily aligned with that of the rest of the population. So we could wonder, does this sort of unequal participation in the online sphere lead ultimately perhaps to unequal political or economic outcomes? Okay, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. Sorry for keep reminding you about time. Yeah. I can see clearly that a lot of questions and comments pop up from the audience, and we have like at least 20 minutes for discussion. So I invite all the presenters maybe to come and sit in the front. We will have the first round of question is 4 questions. I hope it could be like addressed to each of the paper. Let's begin with you, sir, please. Address to which paper?
Just to Lucas's paper.
Okay.
It's my understanding that SBY had a very strong female following. I mean, he was known as the handsome general. And even when he was on his way out, I mean, I noticed in my local mall in SNS, Sumarakan Mall, that lots and lots of females gathered together to see him sign his book. You know. So maybe he has a particular following which accounts for a reluctance to sort of go online and criticize him. I just don't know. But certainly when he was first elected in 2004, I mean, he was seen as a very sort of handsome,
ideal.
I mean, he became a complete, you know, sort of disaster really, because it was 10 years of just, pencitraan. And the other thing was just, I'm sorry I came in late, but in 2012, it was my understanding that actually Ahok and Jokowi were orbited to some extent by Garindra for that election. I mean, they were sort of picked and used as a Trojan horse or a sort of a pair. So it wasn't as though it was entirely the direct election. So most of the direct elections are very important, but they also had a patron.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm not
But thank you. First of all, to make sure it is not biased toward the end of the last presenter, I will collect first the other question to all of the presenter. Anyone have a question for the first presenter? So, yeah, you sir.
Okay, related to the Pak Arif and the papers. What do you think about the current massive infrastructure investment conducted by Jokowi administration? Yes, many studies may be good, and investment is good for growth. But what happened with the inequality? Because like the big projects maybe tends to increase inequality. Do you already explore about this possibility? And for the
Maybe only one.
Okay.
Thank you. Question to the second presenter, that is Darendra, about the fiscal policy. If anyone or comments? Yeah.
What's been the development of the taxing policies in Indonesia the last couple of years? Is it increasing or the tax income?
Thank you, sir. And the last one for Kaun, about the industrial policy and state intervention to the economic development. Yeah, you.
Yeah, I just wonder whether you also incorporate the role of donor funds in your economic analysis.
Thank you.
For major donors like the World Bank, ADB, who are very much focused on infrastructure development, and how the Jokowi government is going to do things differently or similarly.
Thank you. And maybe we can start from Luke to.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for this interesting hypothesis about female following of President SBY. It's hard to answer because there's just a lack of data of what the demographics of online activism is in other cases. I'm working on this, but we basically need more information, more data to compare this and to see if the gender pattern is anything unusual or not, and if it might well relate to that. I mean, I think that SBY was also a sort of, well, scapegoat is the wrong word for it, but the anger was all directed to him, but certainly there was a bigger dynamic, and the Home Affairs Minister was certainly also culpable of getting into this mess around the Blokada bill. So I'm not even sure if people necessarily disagreed with the personality of SBY himself or just used his name to venture anger about the bill. And I think I totally agree that Jokowi and Ahok had their patrons and had their support from the establishment as well, but I think it's much harder to get somebody, I don't know, somebody with almost no established background, like Jokowi, for instance, who became the mayor of Solo with just a furniture business, basically. To get somebody like that president of Indonesia, I think is much harder without direct elections. So you more easily get these charismatic persons. Don't know if that is a sufficient response to that, but
thank you, Doc. Maybe I can add some point on this because I happen to be a LSI researcher in 2003. The LSI is Lembaga Survei Indonesia, like Gallup of Indonesia. It was actually proven by that survey by the time that is the characteristic of SBY as handsome, popular to the public because wibawa. The notion is wibawa. What we call it? Charisma. Yeah, charisma of it is really liked by the respondent of LSE by the time. So that's another view of it. So move to Andy and Arif about that question from Teguh.
Thank you for the question. That also concerned me, but we must admit that we haven't particularly doing research on that area, so it's more, to me, it's more empirical question. But both possibilities there. It can increase inequality, it can also reduce inequality, but I have 2 points to share. We look at the literature, and then there are some literature who say that there are possibility that infrastructure investment can increase inequality. Why? Because infrastructure investment tend to be capitalized by people who already have initial big capital, so can be listened to, and basically like the investment that even though it's not government money, that will rapid train from Jakarta to Bandung, I'm very sure it won't reduce inequality. It will increase inequality because it will benefit people like me who come to Jakarta very often. But you pay 300,000 rupiah, so if it's $30, it's quite a lot. And also another second thing I would like to share with you is our previous research, like we published in 2013, suggests that when we try to decompose the inequality from within region and between regions, so within infrastructure investment can benefit in reducing inequality if the situation is the inequality in Indonesia is contributed more by between regions. But in fact, inequality in Indonesia only slightly, only a little bit contributed by the between region inequality. Most like 80% or 85% is contributed by within region, between income group, not between region. Infrastructure investment that was done by Jokowi, like reducing the gap, like transport in Papua and Sumatra, they will definitely have positive contribution toward reducing inequality, but I'm a bit skeptic about whether it will to large extent reduce inequality. So that's my take.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree.
No more addition, okay? Fine. Kaun, please, for the next question.
Okay, thank you very much. The question was on the role of donor funds in infrastructure development, how Jokowi government is using the fund. So he's basically trying to channel a lot of donor funds in infrastructure to state-owned enterprises. And the reason being is that 4 out of the largest 5 construction firms in Indonesia are state-owned enterprises. Therefore, he has no choice but to channel them into state-owned enterprises. So last year, I think it was last year, he adopted a government bill to provide guarantees for international financing institutions funds which are provided to state-owned enterprises. And as you know, Indonesia is one of the largest beneficiaries of the infrastructure fund from IFIs such as World Bank and ADB. And in some cases, they are doubling in one single year. And on top of that, we have AIIB, which recognise that Indonesia is one of the most important donor countries. So in the future, more and more money will be provided to SOEs, I believe. And this is a funny situation because excluding AIIB, most of the international financial institutions put pressure on developing countries to reduce the size of the state sector. At the same time, Indonesia has no choice but to channel them into SMEs.
Okay. The last one, yeah.
In regard to your question on taxation development, we've been struggling in the last couple of decades that Indonesia has low tax rate and limited tax base, and that happens until these days, although there has been small incremental progress in terms of absolute value of tax collected, but that doesn't change the situation that we are under the shortfall to fund these big projects, infrastructure and general social policy. And in regards to the taxation power, that doesn't mention the big businessmen who allegedly avoid the tax payment after the Panama Papers scandal. But relating to the decentralization, the local government, it seems that there is not big initiative in giving away or conceding to the region to give away the local taxation power enormously, and that is the current situation.
I could update some information that I collect recently about this. That is the quarter to quarter comparison between this quarter, March, and the last year. Also like lower than the last one. And comparing to the target, also it is not achieving the target. So like that's really a burden for the government, current government, about the taxation. We have still time, so another round of question. You, please. Yeah.
So my question is more general, I guess, to all of you. So I come from a public health background. I don't have much political academic background. My question is specifically to the impact of your research. So there's a lot of research done in the academic world on Indonesian politics, on Indonesian culture, on economic and finance. To what extent does your research influence policies? To what extent do public servants in Indonesia actually look at your research to help inform their decisions?
Very interesting question. Yeah, maybe two or more, one or two question more from you here. Yeah.
One short question to
Kahun.
Okay. Thanks. It was a very interesting presentation. My question is, to what extent is the character of the developmental state as you were describing it now different from developmental state under the new order? You suggested some difference in capacities, but does it also create difference in character?
A user in the back, yeah.
Just a very quick one, since I live in Jakarta,
Yeah.
obviously I actually work quite closely with the local government because in a cultural sphere. And over the past 3 years, obviously the Jakarta budget has, I mean, it's a threefold increase.
Jakarta province.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the DKI.
DKI, yeah.
It's gone up from 1.8 billion, about 24 trillion rupiah, to about 72 trillion, which is about 5.5 billion. And that doesn't mean that Jakarta's become suddenly 3 times as rich. It just means that things have been put online, and there's a pretty draconian system going on. I mean, I go in there on a Friday, and on the Monday, the person I'm working with has been fired, or at least, changed. So, and people are really afraid of their jobs. So, the whole tenor of the way in which the civil service operates, it's good and bad, because people are so afraid of their jobs, they're not prepared to take initiatives. But the whole tenor has changed pretty radically, and I'm just wondering whether Jakarta is not one swallow that makes a summer, and it's quite unique. You've got a very highly educated population, or whether what's happening in Jakarta, maybe in Surabaya and Bandung, are things which can be translated onto a national scale.
Thank you. The first question is to everyone. So maybe Andy.
What to say snappily in a few seconds? I think you have to bear in mind that, well, first of all, research serves several different purposes. The kind of, in one one way, there's the policy impact you're talking about there, that it lends itself to certain types of research. There's also the issue about whether you're talking about short-term policy change or long-term changing the framing of the problem, the framing of possible solutions. I think the thing I would say is that academics aren't servants of politicians. They're there to challenge power and structures and propose other ways of doing things. So in a way, research, the trick I think with research is to try and get it into the kind of circles where it might trigger debate. And more often than not, that seems to be in civil society in most countries. So that's probably the entry point to broadening the discussion around these things. One of the tricky things, having worked in the ministry for a year some time ago, is policymakers and civil servants tend to want straightforward answers to questions. Quite often the question is probably the wrong question from an academic point of view, in the sense they've framed the concepts in a way that's very narrow, and you have to try and explain to them. You basically give them the kind of answer that's no use to them when they want a yes/no answer. So I would see research more as kind of opening space for discussion, and you can do that in various ways. If you can get your research into civil society and organisations like INFIC, for example, and their kind of debates. But also bear in mind that research is also a long-term process about the body of knowledge. It's not only there to serve policy, although that's part of the story.
Anyone?
I think there are many routes by which research can contribute to policy. First is by also writing into, like, to contribute to the popular debate through media. Like, we not only write in a journal, we will write in articles. So we always, because people always criticize researchers like us, saying, no one read you. No one read your journal article. Yes, but someone needs to do it. People who write in journal, people who write an op-ed article, we appreciate it. They are people who are trying to change contemporary public policies. But we are, who wrote an journal article, we are trying to build civilization. And then one route. Another route is, I think, you communicate to government, like what you did. That's second route. Third route is, academic can become
policymaker
in Indonesia. That often happens. And but the last route is like this guy, Narendra. So he was from Bapenas and he was educated here in one of the good schools in the world. And when he come back, I'm sure he will change.
Let's hope. So the next question for Kahul.
And the question was the difference in the characteristics of industrial policies between the Jokowi government and the Suharto era. So firstly, obviously the Jokowi government is less protectionist and more selective, and this is mainly because of the changes in the international rules on trade and investment. He cannot, intervene in the economy as Suharto did. Maybe he wants to, but he cannot. But in any sense, he does have room to play with. So last year in April at the WTO, the United States complained about the Make in Indonesia policy on smartphones, and the Indonesian government confidently argued back, saying, "Oh, this is our plan to move up the ladder in the industrialization process, and this policy will apply non-discriminatorily and equally to foreign and domestic players, so both to Samsung and smartphone, iPhone, etc. So this is not a discriminatory policy, so we'll continue with it." And following that, in July that year, the global smartphone manufacturing companies announced that they welcome the local content rules because they literally don't want to mess around with the Indonesian government because the market is so huge. You don't want to get on the wrong page. So he does have some room to play with, but compared to the Suharto era, he does not have, he cannot intervene as strongly as the Suharto government. And the second one is, he's more realistic. I think it's similar reasoning to the first answer, but he doesn't have anyone who's similar to Habibie, for example. So in terms of developing high tech, he knows the limits of the government in climbing up the ladder. Of course, he's still giving money to Dirgantara Indonesia, who's developing all these turbo engines, but he's not as ambitious as Suharto era. So there are two main differences.
Thank you, Kawan. And the last question should be replied by you, I think.
I like the question. I saw the comment. I've been working in Bapenas in the National Ministry of State Planning, which supposedly to be very powerful, as it was in the New Order era. But after the decentralization, that was not the case. Unfortunately, after the law of finance in 2003 and the regional decentralization, the big power, the big chunk of fund was transferred almost entirely to the local and the other ministries. But that's another story. Let me share you this interesting story from the last year. So, Bapenas today, they have to step in two different legs. The first one is to stand in the political vision. So after Jokowi won the presidency, he has this ambitious vision on Nawacita, which was very ambitious in targets and everything. And then we have to stand in our other leg in the technocratic vision, which means that every target should be based on the justification on every justified by any means evidence-based necessary. And that is difficult to reconcile these two different vision, I have to say. But yeah, one story is when the ambitious target of poverty reduction was moderated, was downscaled, there was a public outcry. But that was a thing that we have to reflect, that we have to incorporate, to take together the so-called systemic community involving the academicians, the politicians, and so we can learn from each other. We have this, and we actually have the forum for that. The Musrembang, the deliberation actually already involves this process. But yeah, the difficulty still remains, although the possibility exists. It is in the gesture that Jokowi already recruiting the people, not only from the politician side, but also from the academician side in his inner circle. I think that.
Thank you, Renda. We have no more time for discussion, but as a discussion or the chair, I will a bit add more info on that question about how local government spend their money and why there is SILPA, the unspent budget so huge. For instance, in Jakarta, for the last 4 years, I worked for the World Bank in the cluster of regional decentralization. So I found out that actually for the local government, there is more incentive for them, public official, to work as usual, not to take as the leader of the project, as the task team leader of the project. It is more incentive for them to keep their job at minimum level, because there is no incentive in terms of additional income, for instance. So that's part of the explanation actually. And specifically for case of Jakarta, 2012, when the World Bank tried to give loan for the JEDI project, it is infrastructure project. Ahok by the time was like the vice governor, said to the World Bank, why I should take loan from you like 2 trillion rupiah, while in last year we have unspent money 8 trillion rupiah. So it is like contradictory. On the other hand, in one hand they couldn't spend very well. On the other hand, when they come some urgent matter to be financed, then they didn't take it. So like that's the problem in the local government budget. So however, we have already like 5 minutes more. Okay, maybe for our lady here, the last question, special for or comment.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to ask to Pak Arif, and you said that the declining, there is like a correlation between the commodity boom and inequality. But after 2013, and we saw that the commodity price is declining. And do you see that is there any correlationship to the inequality, and inequality become higher or become lower after 2013? What do you think about that?
I say that the inequality, well, as I mentioned before, I just see the correlation, not necessarily causation. We're trying to see, we have to scrutinize more. But the sign is, after the boom period end, the inequality stays the same, so it doesn't continue increasing. So it may or it may not. So I think invite also other people to do research on this, because this is just correlation, just suspect that there is money to do something.
There's 3 or 4 other hypotheses that we put forward, including decentralization itself, maybe having an impact on inequality. There was also the budget changes, and there was there's another piece of some bulletin of Indonesian economic studies 2 years ago. So there's a number of hypotheses. The thing is trying to separate out or trying to make claims to causality beyond the kind of the macro side.
We don't have yet established.
We haven't figured it out. We're open to ideas.
Open to ideas, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for all the presenter. I will conclude with the conclusion, but my last point is that for all of you or all of us who studied development or have any concern with the development work, we can see that in Indonesia there is so complex the problem is. Right, on the other hand, civil society is very advanced by advancing their work through the mobile platform, etc. But on the other hand, government is still struggling to decide whether to liberalize economy or to make like more interventionist state. So like that's very interesting. Thank you very much, and applause for all the presenters.